The cold does not care who you are. It does not negotiate. It does not show mercy. And on the night of January 17, 1943, it tried to kill 105 men in less than 12 hours. This is not a story about heroes. This is a story about survival when every biological function in your body is shutting down, when your eyelids freeze shut, when your lungs burn with every breath, when the simple act of staying conscious becomes an achievement worth celebrating. The Eastern Front. Winter. Two words that still make military historians pause. Not because of the battles, though, those were brutal beyond imagination, but because of what happened between the battles, in the forests, in the snow, in temperatures so extreme that metal shattered like glass and human skin froze solid in minutes. 105 German soldiers from the 312th Infantry Division were about to experience the longest night of their lives. They would learn exactly how long a human body can function at minus 40 degrees Celsius. They would discover what happens when your shelter burns, your supplies vanish, and the nearest friendly position is 18 kilometers away through waist-deep snow. 83 of them would see sunrise, 22 would not, and every single survivor would carry that night with them until their dying day. But to understand what happened, you need to understand where they were and why they could not simply walk away. The Rzhev Salient, a bulge in the German front line west of Moscow. For over a year, Soviet and German forces had ground each other down in fighting so vicious that veterans of Stalingrad called it worse. The land had been fought over so many times that trees existed only as shattered stumps. Every building was rubble. The earth itself was cratered and torn. In January 1943, the 312th Division held a section of this line near a village that no longer had a name. The village was gone, burned months earlier. All that remained were foundations and chimneys standing like gravestones. 2nd Company, 3rd Battalion, had established a defensive position in what used to be a collective farm. They had fortified one of the few structures still partially intact, a large storage building with thick stone walls, not comfortable, but survivable. The walls blocked wind. They had a stove, fuel, rations. As winter positions went, it was almost luxurious. On the afternoon of January 17th, they received orders. Soviet forces were massing to the north. 2nd Company would conduct a reconnaissance patrol to determine enemy strength and positions. Standard mission. Take a platoon-sized element, scout the suspected assembly area, return before dark. Simple. Except nothing was simple on the Eastern Front in winter. Lieutenant Franz Becker led the patrol. 28 years old, former school teacher from Hamburg. He had been on the Eastern Front for 11 months. Long enough to respect the cold, not long enough to truly fear it. He selected 30 men, veterans mostly, soldiers who knew how to move quietly through snow, how to read tracks, how to survive in hostile territory. They dressed in layers, white camouflage smocks over their uniforms. Each man carried rations for 2 days, ammunition, and most critically, dry socks and extra gloves. In winter warfare, dry socks can be the difference between keeping your feet and losing them to frostbite. They moved out at 1300 hours. Temperature was minus 28 Celsius, cold but manageable if you kept moving. The sky was clear, visibility good. They expected to be back by nightfall. At 1500 hours, they spotted Soviet positions. A company-sized element, possibly more. Dug in along a tree line 3 kilometers north of the farm. Becker made notes, counted vehicles, estimated troop strength, exactly what the mission required. Then the weather changed. In the Arctic and subarctic regions, weather does not shift gradually. It transforms. One moment you have clear skies. The next, clouds roll in like a physical wall. The temperature does not drop slowly. It plummets. By 1530, the wind had picked up. By 1600, snow was falling so heavily that visibility dropped to less than 50 meters, and the temperature began falling. -30, -35, -38. Becker made the call. Return to base immediately. The patrol turned south, retracing their steps, except the snow was already covering their tracks, and in whiteout conditions, even experienced soldiers can become disoriented. At 1645, they should have reached the farm. They found only open fields and scattered tree stumps. Becker checked his compass. They were heading south. The farm had to be close. They pushed forward. By 1700 hours, full darkness had fallen. The temperature hit -40 Celsius, and they were lost. Not dramatically lost, not hopelessly separated from friendly lines, just turned around enough that in zero visibility, in killing cold, they could not find their way back to a building that was less than 2 kilometers away. Becker gathered his men. They needed shelter. Now, human bodies start shutting down at -40. Fingers and toes first, then hands and feet. Then core temperature drops, and you die. Time was measured in hours at best. They found a small depression in the ground. Not much, but it provided minimal wind protection. The men huddled together, trying to conserve warmth. Some suggested building a fire. Becker refused. The smoke would give away their position to Soviet patrols. They would wait for the storm to pass, then navigate back. Reasonable decision. Fatal mistake. The storm did not pass. It intensified. Wind speeds increased. The temperature continued dropping. -42, -43. At these temperatures, exposed skin freezes in under 2 minutes. Breath freezes in. Your mustache and beard. Your eyelashes frost over and stick together. Private Josef Hartmann was the first to realize how serious this was. 20 years old, from a farming family in Bavaria. He had grown up with cold winters, but nothing like this. His fingers had gone numb despite his gloves. He could not feel his toes. When he breathed, his lungs felt like they were full of broken glass. He looked around at the other men huddled in the depression. Most were already showing signs of hypothermia, shivering violently, confused speech, sluggish movements, and it had only been an hour. Hartmann did the math. They had perhaps 4 hours before men started dying, maybe less. Corporal Ernst Miller, no relation to the tanker from our previous story, was thinking the same thing. He had served in Finland before being transferred to Russia. He had seen what extreme cold did to men. It started with the extremities, fingers, toes, ears, nose. Frostbite set in fast. Then the shivering stopped, which was worse. When your body stopped shivering, it meant your core temperature had dropped to dangerous levels. After that came confusion, then unconsciousness, then death. Muller pulled Becker aside. They needed fire, not for comfort, for survival. Smoke giving away their position to Soviets was preferable to freezing to death. Becker hesitated. Fire required fuel. The only available fuel was the few scraggly bushes scattered around the area. Gathering them meant exposure. Men moving around in the dark, away from the group, in killing cold. But Muller was right. Without heat, they would die. The decision was made. Gather fuel, build fire, survive the night. 8 men volunteered to collect wood. They spread out in pairs, never going more than 20 meters from the depression. They pulled up bushes, broke branches from the few remaining tree stumps, gathered anything that would burn. Private Klaus Schneider and his partner Corporal Hans Weber moved east from the depression. The wind was so strong they had to lean into it to stay upright. Snow pelted their faces like tiny needles. Weber found a decent-sized bush and started pulling it from the frozen ground. The bush came loose suddenly. Weber stumbled backward, lost his balance, and fell. A simple fall. In normal conditions, embarrassing. At -43 degrees, potentially fatal. Weber tried to get up. His hands sank into deep snow. His gloves, already damp with sweat and melted snow from exertion, now soaked through completely. By the time Schneider helped him to his feet, Weber's hands were freezing. They returned to the depression with their wood. The other teams came back with similar small amounts. Not much, but enough for a small fire. Maybe. Getting the fire started proved nearly impossible. Matches kept blowing out in the wind. The wood was damp and frozen. Sergeant Otto Braun finally got a small flame going using a precious piece of paper from his notebook and some lint from his pocket. The men fed it carefully, adding tiny twigs, then larger pieces. The fire grew. Not large, not particularly warm, but it was heat. The men clustered around it, desperate for any relief from the cold. And that is when they made their second fatal mistake. In extreme cold, when you have been hypothermic and suddenly encounter heat, your body reacts violently. Blood vessels that had constricted to preserve core temperature suddenly dilate. Blood rushes to extremities. And if those extremities are severely frostbitten, the pain is excruciating. Weber, whose hands had gotten wet, started screaming when feeling returned to his fingers. The pain was so intense he nearly passed out. Other men who had early-stage frostbite experienced similar agony as circulation returned. But worse than the pain was what the fire revealed. In the flickering light, the men could see each other's faces, skin white and waxy, ice forming on eyebrows and beards, eyes sunken and dull. They looked like corpses already. Becker took stock. 30 men had left the farm, 30 were here, but at least 8 showed advanced signs of hypothermia, confusion, slurred speech. Some wanted to remove their coats because they felt hot, a common and deadly symptom of severe hypothermia. The body's temperature regulation fails, and victims feel burning up even as they freeze to death. The fire would not last more than an hour with the limited fuel they had gathered. Sending men out to gather more meant exposing already hypothermic soldiers to killing cold. But without fire, everyone would die. Becker made a command decision. The healthiest men would take turns gathering fuel in shifts, 15 minutes maximum exposure. Then return to the fire to warm up before the next shift. Rotate constantly. Keep the fire going. Keep everyone alive until dawn. It was a good plan. It should have worked. But -43 degrees does not care about good plans. The first fuel gathering shift went out. 6 men. They returned 12 minutes later with armfuls of brush and broken wood. One man, Private Friedrich Bauer, did not come back with them. They had lost sight of him in the blowing snow, called for him, got no response. They could not search. At these temperatures, stopping movement for more than a few minutes meant death. They returned to the fire with what they had collected. Becker organized a search party. 3 men, himself included. They moved in the direction the fuel party had gone, calling Bauer's name. The wind swallowed their voices. They found him 30 meters from the depression. He had sat down. Just for a moment, he probably thought. Just to rest. At -43, sitting down is surrendering. Your body heat drains into the frozen ground. Your muscles stiffen. Standing up becomes impossible. Bauer was still conscious, barely. His speech was incomprehensible. Becker and the other 2 men tried to lift him. He was dead weight, muscles rigid from cold. They dragged him back to the fire. By The time they got Böhmer to the flames, his core temperature had dropped to critical levels. He was no longer shivering. His skin was blue-white, his breathing shallow and irregular. They tried to warm him gradually, the proper treatment for severe hypothermia. But without proper equipment, without shelter, without medical supplies, there was little they could do. Böhmer died at 2100 hours, 4 hours after the patrol had gotten lost. He never regained full consciousness. His last words were asking for his mother. The men sat in silence around the fire. They had just watched one of their own die from nothing more than cold. No bullets, no bombs, just air temperature. And they still had 8 hours until dawn. Morale collapsed. Some men openly wept. Others stared into the fire with dead eyes. A few started talking about surrendering to Soviet forces. At least in a POW camp, they might have shelter. Muller, the corporal who had served in Finland, stood up. He was angry. Angry at the cold, angry at the situation, angry at men giving up. He reminded them of basic facts. They were less than 2 kilometers from their lines, maybe 3 at most. When dawn came, they could navigate back. But only if they survived the night. That meant keeping the fire going. That meant staying alert. That meant not giving up. His words steadied the group, not because of inspiring rhetoric, but because anger was better than despair. Anger kept you warm. Despair let the cold in. They organized better. Fuel gathering shifts reduced to 4 men, 10 minutes maximum. Everyone else stayed at the fire, moving constantly, generating body heat through motion. They paired men up. Buddy system. Watch each other for signs of hypothermia. Stay verbal. Keep talking even when you do not want to. At 2200 hours, Weber's hands had swollen to twice their normal size. The tissue was gray-black, advanced frostbite. He would lose fingers, possibly entire hands if he survived. The pain had become so intense that he begged someone to cut his hands off. Muller gave him morphine from the patrol medical kit. It helped slightly. At 2300 hours, the wind shifted. Instead of blowing from the north, it came from the east. The depression that had provided minimal shelter now funneled wind directly at them. The fire, already struggling, nearly went out. Men formed a windbreak with their bodies, sacrificing their own warmth to keep the flames alive. At midnight, they heard sounds. Movement in the darkness beyond their small circle of firelight. Everyone froze. Soviet patrol, wounded calling for help, or just the wind playing tricks? Becker grabbed his rifle, peered into the darkness, called out in German, no response, called out in broken Russian. Still nothing. The sounds faded. They never learned what made them. At 0100 hours, Private Hartmann, the young Bavarian, stopped responding to questions. His partner tried to rouse him. Hartmann's eyes were open but unfocused, his breathing ragged. They pulled him closer to the fire, forced him to drink water from a canteen, though the water was so cold it was barely liquid. Slowly, Hartmann came back. His first words were asking what day it was. He had lost time. Gap in memory. Classic sign of severe hypothermia affecting brain function. At 0200 hours, fuel gathering became nearly impossible. The temperature had dropped to -45 degrees, the coldest recorded temperature of that entire winter in that region. Men sent to gather wood could barely function. Their hands would not grip properly. Their legs moved sluggishly. One man, Corporal Johann Metzger, returned from a fuel run and collapsed at the fire. They thought he was dead. He was not. He had simply used every reserve of energy getting back. It took 15 minutes before he could speak. The fire was dying. They were out of easily accessible fuel. Sending men further out meant they might not make it back. Becker faced an impossible choice. Let the fire die, and the hope body heat alone could sustain them until dawn, or send men into the darkness knowing some would not return. Mueller suggested a third option. Burn their equipment, not weapons or critical gear, but non-essential items. Wooden rifle stocks could be broken and burned, leather straps and belts, anything combustible. Men hesitated. Destroying equipment was a court-martial offense. Then someone laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Court-martial required living long enough to face charges. The fire needed fuel. They started breaking down non-essential gear. Wooden pieces from ammunition crates, leather from pack straps, paper from notebooks and letters. One man burned photographs of his family. He did not explain why. Maybe because they were paper and the fire needed fuel. Maybe because he did not think he would survive to see them again. The fire grew slightly, enough to sustain them another hour, maybe two. At 0300 hours, they heard the sounds again, closer this time. Definitely movement, multiple sources. Becker organized defensive positions. If Soviet forces were out here in this weather, they were likely as desperate as the Germans. A firefight in these conditions would kill everyone, regardless of who won. The sounds continued for 10 minutes, then stopped. Dawn was still 3 hours away. At 0400 hours, Private Schneider began hallucinating. He insisted his dead brother was calling to him from the darkness, wanted to go find him. His partner physically restrained him. In severe hypothermia, the brain malfunctions. People see things, hear voices. Rational thought disappears. Schneider fought desperately to break free. Took 3 men to hold him down until the episode passed. At 0500 hours, the first hint of pre-dawn light appeared on the eastern horizon. Not sunrise yet, just the sky beginning to lighten from absolute black to deep blue. But it was hope, visible, measurable, progress toward dawn. The men who were still conscious counted minutes. 58 men were still functioning at some level. 17 were in bad shape, severe hypothermia, advanced frostbite. 2 were unconscious, and Böhmer was dead, his body frozen solid 10 meters from the fire where they had moved it. At 0530, there was enough light to see. Not well, but enough to make out shapes in the landscape. Becker studied the terrain. Nothing looked familiar. The storm had changed everything. Snow had drifted, creating new hills where flat ground had been. But there, to the south-southeast, was that a chimney? One of the ruined buildings near the farm? He was not sure. Could be. Could be another ruin from another nameless village. But it was direction, it was purpose, and staying here meant more deaths. At 0600 hours, with the sky turning gray with approaching dawn, Becker gave the order. They were moving out. Everyone who could walk would walk. Those who could not would be carried. They would head toward the chimney. If it was not the farm, they would keep searching. But they would move. Motion generated heat. Sitting still was death. Men struggled to their feet. Some could barely stand. Others had to be supported by comrades. The 2 unconscious soldiers were fashioned into crude stretchers using rifles and coats. They left the fire burning, left their position, and started walking through knee-deep snow in -43-degree cold toward a chimney that might be salvation or might be just another frozen ruin. The march was agony. Each step required tremendous effort, lifting legs from deep snow, maintaining balance, simply staying conscious. Men fell repeatedly, were helped up, fell again. Some begged to be left behind, were refused. Schneider, the one who had hallucinated, kept asking where his rifle was. He had left it at the fire, kept insisting they needed to go back for it. Finally stopped asking and just stumbled forward in silence. Weber, with his destroyed hands, could not help himself or others. He walked alone, hands tucked under his armpits, face locked in a grimace of pain. The chimney grew closer, meter by meter, agonizing progress through snow and cold and pain. Some men were weeping, some were praying. Some had gone beyond either and simply moved mechanically, one foot forward, then the other, again and again. At 06:45, the sun broke the horizon, pale and cold and beautiful. The temperature actually rose slightly, -41, still deadly. But 2 degrees warmer felt like a gift, and the chimney was not alone. There were other structures nearby. Ruins, yes, but familiar ruins. This was the village. The farm was close. At 0700 hours, they saw smoke, a real building, with fire, with warmth, the farm. Less than 400 meters away. Men started crying. Some fell to their knees. Others tried to run and collapsed after a few steps. They had made it. Against every odd, against temperature that should have killed them all, they had survived. The men at the farm saw them coming, rushed out to help, carried the wounded inside, stoked fires, brought hot soup, blankets, medical attention for the frostbitten and hypothermic. 83 men entered the farm that morning. 22 did not. Böhmer had died during the night. 5 more had been lost during fuel-gathering runs, wandered into the darkness and never returned. 16 had given up during the march, sat down to rest and never stood again. The farm's defenders found their bodies over the following days, frozen, some less than 50 meters from safety. So close, not close enough. Of the 83 survivors, 41 required medical evacuation, severe frostbite, hypothermia, damage to internal organs. Weber lost both hands. Schneider lost all his toes. Hartmann lost 3 fingers and both ears. Dozens more lost individual fingers or toes. Becker survived physically intact, but would spend the next 3 days in a semi-conscious state, his body shutting down from exhaustion and exposure. When he finally woke, his first question was how many they had lost. When told 22, he wept. The official report classified it as routine patrol losses due to severe weather. No blame assigned, no investigation. Men died from cold on the Eastern Front every day. 22 was not unusual, but the survivors knew better. They had faced something beyond combat, beyond enemy action. They had fought the universe itself, the cold, the dark, the fundamental hostility of nature to human life, and barely won. None of them ever spoke about it casually. When asked about their time on the Eastern Front, they mentioned battles and retreats and the general misery of winter warfare. But that specific night, that required trust, required understanding, required talking to someone who had been there or somewhere similar. Because how do you explain to someone who has never experienced it what -45 degrees feels like? How the cold is not just uncomfortable, but actively hostile. How it creeps into your body through every opening, every breath, every exposed inch of skin. How do you describe watching a friend die from nothing more than sitting down? How do you convey the desperation of burning family photographs to stay alive? How do you put into words the moment you realize you might not survive, and the only reason you keep fighting is because the men next to you are still fighting? You cannot. Not really. So most did not try. After the war, a few survivors reconnected, met for quiet drinks on the anniversary, did not talk much, just sat together, remembering. Survivors' guilt haunted some. Why had they made it when Böhmer had not? When the 5 who wandered off had not? When the 16 who sat down had not? Pure chance, blind luck, divine intervention? There was no answer, just the fact of survival and the burden of memory. The 312th Division was Disbanded in 1944 after catastrophic losses during the Soviet summer offensive, the survivors scattered to other units, other fronts. Some made it to war's end, some did not. Becker survived, returned to Hamburg to find his home destroyed in bombing raids, became a teacher again, never married, died in 1978. His students remembered him as quiet and kind, but distant, like part of him was somewhere else, still in Russia, still in the cold. Muller survived. Lost both legs to frostbite during another winter patrol 3 months later. Returned to Finland after the war. Worked as a fisherman despite his disability. Refused to ever speak about Russia. His family learned about that night from letters discovered after his death in 1993. Hartmann survived, lost his farm when East and West Germany divided, crossed to the West, worked in a factory, married, had children, grandchildren, lived to see German reunification, died in 2001. At his funeral, his grandson found a small notebook in his belongings. Inside, a single entry. January 17, 1943. 22 names. Nothing else. The Eastern Front consumed millions. The cold killed hundreds of thousands. One night, 105 men, 22 deaths should not stand out. Statistically insignificant, a rounding error in the vast accounting of that terrible war. But to those 83 who survived, it was everything. The night they learned exactly how fragile human life is, how quickly death can come when environment turns hostile, how much suffering the human body can endure and still function. They learned that survival is not noble or glorious, it is painful and desperate and often unfair. That sometimes living is harder than dying. That carrying the memory of those who did not make it can weigh more than any physical burden. The ruins of that farm are still there, overgrown now. The depression where they huddled is filled with soil and vegetation. The chimneys that guided them home have collapsed. Nature has reclaimed the battlefield. But if you know where to look, in the archives in Berlin and Moscow, you can find the records, casualty reports, weather logs showing temperatures, brief mentions of patrol losses, the paper trail of that night. And if you find the survivors' families, some still keep the letters, the few times their fathers or grandfathers wrote about Russia. Careful words, minimal detail. But between the lines, if you know how to read them, the truth. The cold tried to kill 105 men in 12 hours. It succeeded with 22. The remaining 83 carried that night forward, into post-war lives, into marriages and careers and the ordinary business of living. But part of them stayed in that depression, huddled around a dying fire, counting minutes until dawn. This is their story. Not sanitized, not glorified, just the truth of one night when men faced nature at its most hostile and barely survived. The cold does not care who you are. It does not negotiate. It does not show mercy. But sometimes, just sometimes, human stubbornness and collective will can defy it. Not easily, not without cost, but enough to see one more sunrise. The morning after brought its own challenges. The 83 survivors were in desperate condition, but now faced the bureaucratic reality of military medicine on the Eastern Front. Field hospitals were overwhelmed. Serious cases like Weber's hands could be evacuated. But men with moderate frostbite, they received basic treatment and were expected to return to duty. The battalion medical officer, Dr. Heinrich Vogel, worked through the morning examining each man. His field hospital was a partially destroyed farmhouse with limited supplies. No X-ray equipment, no proper surgical tools for amputations, just bandages, morphine, and his experience treating frozen flesh. Vogel had been on the Eastern Front since Operation Barbarossa began in June 1941. He had seen frostbite in every imaginable stage, the blackened fingers and toes that clearly needed amputation, the white, waxy flesh that might recover with proper care. The borderline cases where only time would tell if tissue would survive or rot. That morning, he looked at 41 men who needed immediate medical evacuation, but he had transport capacity for 15. The rest would have to stay at the battalion aid station and hope for the best. The triage was brutal. Weber with no hands, evacuate immediately. Schneider with no toes, he could still hold a rifle. Stay and recover here. Hartmann missing fingers and ears. Ears were cosmetic. Missing fingers on his left hand did not prevent shooting. Stay. Men who had survived 12 hours at -45 degrees were being told they were not injured enough for proper medical care. Some accepted it with resignation. Others protested. A few broke down completely. Corporal Metzger, who had collapsed after the fuel gathering run, had severe frostbite on both feet. Vogel examined him and made notes. Second-degree frostbite, possibly third on the toes. Needed observation. Might lose toes, but probably not the feet. Not bad enough for evacuation. Metzger stared at the doctor in disbelief. His feet were purple and swollen. Every step was agony. How was this not bad enough? Vogel's response was blunt. There were men with no feet who needed evacuation ahead of him, men with frozen lungs who would die without immediate surgery. Metzger could walk, even if it hurt. Therefore he stayed. This was the calculus of war medicine. Not heal everyone, just keep enough men functional to hold the line. By midday, the 15 worst cases were loaded onto trucks for transport to the rear hospital at Vyazma. The journey would take 6 hours if roads were clear, longer if Soviet artillery was active. Some would not survive the trip, but it was better odds than staying at the battalion aid station. The remaining 26 required care, but were technically fit for duty. Vogel had them housed in the warmest building available and started treatment. Frostbitten flesh needed gradual rewarming. Too fast and tissue damage worsened. Too slow and gangrene set in. The treatment was simple and excruciating. Affected areas were immersed in water slowly heated from cold to body temperature over 30 minutes. As frozen tissue thawed, nerve endings came back to life. The pain was described by multiple survivors as worse than being shot. Men screamed, some passed out, others begged for it to stop. But the alternative was amputation, so they endured. Private August Richter had frostbite on both hands and his nose. During the rewarming treatment, he bit through his leather belt from the pain. When his nose thawed, the skin sloughed off in sheets. Underneath was raw, bloody flesh. Vogel bandaged it and moved to the next patient. There were 25 more waiting. Meanwhile, the dead required attention. 22 bodies, some frozen so solid they could not be moved without risking breaking limbs. They were laid in an unused barn. No immediate burial was possible. The ground was frozen meters deep. They would stay there until spring thaw allowed digging, or until Soviet advances forced evacuation and they were abandoned. Becker visited the barn that afternoon. 22 men. He knew every name, knew their backgrounds. Private Bauer, the first to die, had been a baker before the war. Corporal Fritz Kessler, lost during fuel gathering, had 3 children back in Stuttgart. Sergeant Paul Zimmermann, who sat down during the march and never stood, had survived 2 years on the Eastern Front, only to die a few hundred meters from safety. Becker tried to write letters to their families, started a dozen times. How do you tell a mother her son died from cold? How do you explain that he was not even in combat, that he just sat down to rest? He gave up. The official notifications would be sent. Killed in action, no details. Maybe that was kinder. The day after, Battalion Command issued new orders. Despite losses, the defensive position had to be maintained. The survivors of 2nd Company would return to duty. Light duties for those recovering from frostbite. Full duties for everyone else. There was no time for mourning, no memorial service. The war continued. Soviet forces were probing German lines daily. Another attack could come at any time. The line had to hold. Hartmann, missing 3 fingers and both ears, was assigned to ammunition detail. He could carry boxes even with damaged hands. Schneider, missing all his toes, became a radio operator. He could sit and work equipment. Metzger, with ruined feet, was put on guard duty where he could lean against a wall. They were broken men being used until they broke completely. But this was total war. Everyone who could function did function. Rest was a luxury for the dead. A week later, the spring thaw began early. Temperatures rose to -10, then -5. The frozen bodies in the barn started to thaw. The smell became overwhelming. A burial detail was organized. They dug a mass grave in ground that was finally soft enough to work. 22 men went into that hole. A chaplain said words. Someone fired a salute. Then it was filled in and marked with a simple wooden cross. 3 months later, Soviet offensives overran the position. German forces retreated. The grave was left behind. After the war, Soviet authorities bulldozed most German military cemeteries in the region. That cross, that grave, those 22 men disappeared. No records of where exactly they were buried survive. Their families never recovered the bodies. But the story of that night continued through the survivors. Hartmann wrote about it once in that notebook found after his death. Just the names and the date, his way of remembering, his way of honoring those who did not make it. Muller told his wife on their wedding night. She asked about his legs, about the scars. He told her everything, then never spoke of it again. She kept the secret until he died, then shared it with their children. Becker never wrote it down, never spoke it aloud. But former students remember him staring out windows during winter storms, completely still, somewhere else. When the bell rang ending class, he would blink and return. But for those minutes, he was back in Russia, back in the cold, back with men who did not come home. The Eastern Front produced countless such stories. Men pushed beyond human limits, survivors carrying guilt and memory, families who never learned the details of how their loved ones died. It was the nature of that war. Industrial-scale death, individual tragedies lost in overwhelming numbers. But every one of those numbers was a person. Every casualty report represented someone's son, husband, father, brother. Every mass grave held individuals with names and stories and lives cut short. The 105 men of that patrol were not special. They were ordinary soldiers caught in extraordinary circumstances. Their survival or death was largely chance. Who sat down at the wrong moment, who kept moving, who had slightly better cold weather gear, who had a friend grab them when they started to give up. Nothing about that night was glorious, nothing heroic in the traditional sense. They did not charge enemy positions, did not hold against overwhelming odds. They just tried not to freeze to death, and most succeeded. That is worth remembering, not as a tale of military valor, but as a testament to human endurance, to what people can survive when they have no choice, to the bonds formed when facing death together. The cold tried to kill 105 men. It succeeded with 22. The numbers are simple. The reality was anything but. Every man who survived carried scars, physical ones from frostbite, psychological ones from watching friends die, spiritual ones from asking why they lived when others did not. Some handled it well. found ways to integrate the experience into their post-war lives, used it as perspective when facing smaller challenges. Others never recovered, drank too much, pushed away families, lived half-lives haunted by a night 7 decades in the past. There is no moral to this story, no lesson that makes the suffering worthwhile. 22 men died horrible deaths for no strategic gain. The patrol accomplished nothing militarily. The farm was abandoned 3 months later anyway. But their story survives because the survivors made sure it did, in quiet ways, in notebooks and letters and carefully chosen moments to share what happened. They made sure those 22 names were not forgotten, that their deaths, pointless as they might seem, were at least acknowledged. This is what we owe the dead, not grand monuments necessarily, but memory, recognition. The simple act of saying their names and acknowledging they existed. They suffered. They died. Somewhere in Western Russia, beneath soil and grass and decades of growth, 22 bodies rest in an unmarked location. Their families never found closure, never visited a grave, never had a place to mourn. But they are not forgotten. This story ensures that. The night of January 17, 1943. 105 men, minus 45 degrees, 12 hours, 22 dead, 83 survivors, numbers that represent real people, real suffering, real courage in the face of an enemy that could not be fought, only endured. The cold does not care who you are. It does not negotiate. It does not show mercy. But we can care. We can remember. We can honor those who faced it and fell to it. That is the least they deserve, the very least we can give.